internet nearly broke this week in a grand debate over Yanny versus Laurel. You see, someone found a sound clip on vocabulary.com, and they realized that it sounded markedly different to different people listening to it. So they posted it on social media, and soon it went viral. People began to text, yell at each other online. You know what I'm talking about? Writing in all caps with an inordinate number of exclamation points on the end. It says Laurel. No, it's Yanny, you daft fool. But here, you don't have to take my word for it. I'll play the clip for you. Oops. Rich, can you hit play? Thank you.
Laurel, 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 Laurel.
How many of you heard Laurel? How many of you heard Yanny? It's amazing, isn't it? Remarkable that we can all listen to the same thing and hear something so very different. I mean, Yanny isn't that close to Laurel. Or perhaps what's actually remarkable is that the vast majority of the time, even though we're so different, even though we're formed in such different ways, we do usually hear the same thing or close to the same thing as one another. On Pentecost, there was a similar sound clip that came through town. She was called the Spirit. And each person heard her a little differently. Perhaps most remarkable, if this week is any indication of our propensity for division, is that those people gathered there that Pentecost day, they didn't set up Yanny and Laurel camps. They didn't yell at one another and say, "You're hearing her wrong." Well, except for those who were standing at a bit of a distance, who didn't hear much of anything except noise, and who accused all the rest of early morning drunkenness. No, most of those gathered that day, they looked around in wonder and marveled at how the Spirit could speak to each of them in their own heart language. It was like a mini United Nations happened right there that day. Do you know that the United Nations employs 120 interpreters and many more translators so that all the member nations can talk to one another in their own native tongue, hear what's going on in the conversation in their own native tongue? But only one translator was needed on Pentecost, the Spirit. This week we looked out across several valleys of dry bones. We heard this week of another school shooting. This time it was in Texas. And this shooting officially made it more deadly in our country to attend school in 2018 than to be in the armed services. Now think about that. Our children going to school are at greater risk of losing their lives than those who are serving in our military. We have a problem. We know we have a problem. But as a country, we can't seem to hear each other, to listen to each other. We can't seem to understand each other well enough to come together and solve this problem. It's heartbreaking. This week, more than 100 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli army in Gaza as they were protesting the U.S. Embassy's move to Jerusalem. For a long time, no one in this conflict has really been able to hear one another, including the United States, who has put itself in the middle of it all. We all know that violent conflict in the Middle East, oppression, and human rights violations have been an ongoing major problem on the world stage for decades. But when all parties try to sit down and talk to one another and hold each other accountable to doing justice and creating peace, we've seen time and time again that little understanding or little way forward can be found. It's heartbreaking. Last week, news also leaked of our president, the leader of our country and arguably our world, once again dehumanizing a whole group of people. How do you even begin to have respectful dialogue or solve problems or listen for the moving of the Spirit when we don't see each other as human? And the truth is, really, if we're honest, there are few among us these days who are easily able to see the full dignity of each other's humanity. And before you say, no, not me, I'm not like that, that's not my problem, think about how many times in the past year or two you've looked at someone else and thought that they were as delusional as someone drunk before 9 a.m. and were completely unable to recognize the Spirit's presence in their life. It seems to me that we have become much better at accusing one another of drunkenness or insanity or moral depravity, of judging each other and giving up on each other, than actually listening to each other and marveling at the diversity of ways that the Spirit is speaking to each of us. I know I'm as guilty of this as anyone. Yesterday was probably the most watched wedding of the year between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. I admit I didn't take much interest in it, and I didn't sit glued to my TV as some people did yesterday. But then after the wedding, I kept hearing all over social media about this preacher who took the world to church yesterday. And so I had to log on and watch this wedding homily. Reverend Michael Curry used the repeated refrain throughout his sermon, "Love is powerful." He said if human beings ever harness the energies of love, for the second time in the history of the world, we will have discovered fire. Love is the very fire and energy of real life. He went on to say, Dr. King was right. We must discover the power of love, the redemptive power of love, and when we discover that, we will be able to make of this world a new world. Pentecost, if it is nothing else, reminds us that it isn't just Jesus and it isn't just the saints or sages of old who have been able to tap into that resurrecting power of God's love, but it's us, little old us as well. We have been given that power as well. And not just some of us, not just Democrats and not just Republicans, not just Americans or those who speak English, not just those with a certain mainline, tame experience of God, and not just the mystics with their wild experiences of God. It's all of us. We have all been given the ability to tap into this power of God's love, this transformative, world-making, world-healing power that we call the Spirit. The prophet Ezekiel had a grand vision of what would happen when the Spirit of God's love blew over the valleys of despair that seem so lifeless to us. He envisioned that they could become filled with life again, that all together, filled with God's Spirit, we could become the strongest force on earth, even if our lives feel like they're over right now, even if things feel like they're too far gone. But it requires we let go. It requires we listen. It requires we follow. It requires we love, even when love seems to make no sense in the moment. Jessica Powers writes a startling reflection on Pentecost, in which she compares trying to follow after the Spirit to the elusiveness of trying to follow the wind. As we think about what it looks like to open ourselves up to the Spirit resting on us and empowering us, I ask you to consider her poem. She writes, "To live with the Spirit of God is to be a listener. It is to keep the vigil of mystery, earthless and still. One leans to catch the stirring of the Spirit, strange as the wind's will. The soul that walks where the wind of the Spirit blows turns like a wandering weather vane toward love. It may lament like Job or Jeremiah. It may echo the wounded heart, the mateless dove. It may rejoice in spaciousness of meadow that emulates the freedom of the sky. Always, it walks in waylessness, unknowing. It has cast down forever from its hand the compass of whither and why. To live with the Spirit of God is to be a lover. It is to become love, like the one toward whom we strain with metaphors of creatures, sweep and rust and wind's whim. The soul is all activity, all silence. And though it surges Godward toward its goal, it holds, as moving earth holds sleeping noonday, the peace that is the listening of the soul." Now again, like last week's ascension story, I have no sense of certainty of whether this story, with its blustery multilingual flames, is myth or miracle. But also, like last week, I do know that whether myth or miracle, this story is true, even the parts that aren't. I know it is true because church is born, the kingdom of God is born, beloved community is born, the life we hope for and long for is born whenever we understand each other, listen to each other, marvel at, respect, and appreciate the ways the Spirit is moving in each of our lives. Love takes flight when we recognize the Spirit in each of us, empowering us, moving us. After all that online screaming and shouting that went on this week about Laurel and Yanni, it turns out that no one was wrong. Or put another way, everyone was right. It depends on the pitches that your ears can hear. If you adjust the pitch and the frequency of that sound clip, you can hear it differently. If you're interested, the New York Times has put out a tool where you can actually adjust it so you can hear both Yanni and Laurel. One of the beautiful things about the United Church of Christ, which is one of our two denominations here, is that unlike most denominations, our denomination has not required conformity, not even in belief. It's one of the first things that attracted me to the UCC. We allow for this freedom for each person to have their own unique experience of the Spirit and have that validated in the church. And then we come together and we covenant and we promise to each other that we will do this thing called worship and life and spiritual journey with each other, alongside each other, but that we will continue to recognize the Spirit. Now, we're not always great at doing that. We're flawed, just like any other human institution. But when I've seen that we get it right, it's a truly beautiful thing to witness. I wish that kind of community and that kind of love and respect for our whole world. So this week, choose to recognize the Spirit in the lives around you. Choose to recognize the Spirit even in those you might call an enemy. Choose to see humanity and dignity around you. Listen more deeply than you've ever listened before. Put down that compass you have of whither and why. Let go of your need to be right. And let that mighty Spirit, filled with that power of love, lift you up into new life and new love. Not just you, but you and your neighbor and your enemy all together. May it be so. Amen.